so much. I'm Gina Nahai, and I'm your moderator for the evening. Just a couple of words on what we're going to do, but before that, first of all, we're getting recorded for podcast. I don't know if that matters to anybody or not. And also we have a program here, so please, and upcoming events, so on your chair, so please pay close attention and come to all the upcoming events. The purpose, our purpose tonight is to get a little bit of a realistic view of what it's like once you have a book deal and it's time to actually find someone to read that book, both fiction and nonfiction. And what I'm hoping to do is to give from people who work in the field an inside view of what it's like on the other end. And also perhaps to debunk a couple of myths that for some reason it seems to me that publishers love to perpetuate, and that sometimes the media, including the New York Times, which that'll come up in a minute, also love to perpetuate, such as you write a book and someone's going to help you publicize it. Or you write a book and somebody other than your mother's going to want to read it. That's another one. But, okay, here's the thing. I had in my class the other night a near mutiny when I said, you guys make sure you come to the panel, because a couple of the students said, well, we went to the thing last year and all they talked about was that no one ever buys books and nobody ever gets published, and so why should we worry about how we get it? So there is also good news tonight. If you pay close attention, I may have to point out the good news in between the lines, but there is good news. There is good news. Let me start out by introducing our very distinguished panelists who really have honored us, and thank you so much for giving your time and your fabulous expertise. Yes. Okay, so at my far end is David Ulin, book editor of the Los Angeles Times, author of The Myth of Solid Ground, Earthquakes, Prediction, and the Fault Line Between Reason and Faith. Isn't that a good title? And the editor of Another City, writing from Los Angeles, and of Writing Los Angeles, a literary anthology, which won the 2002 California Book Award. He's written for The Atlantic Monthly, The Nation, The New York Times Book Review, Book Forum, National Public Radio's All Things Considered. His essay, The Half-Birthday of the Apocalypse, that's also a good title, was nominated for the 2004 Pushcart Prize. Karen Grigsby next to David, is a correspondent for the national desk of NPR News. On the national desk, she covers both breaking news and features, with a special interest in the nexus of race, culture, and media politics. Bates reports frequently on the media and publishing industries for NPR, and is an annual speaker at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. She is the co-author of the best-selling etiquette book, Basic Black, Home Training for Modern Times, and of a mystery series featuring reporter sleuth Alex Powell. Six-time Emmy Award winner and NAACP Award winner David Boul is a 10-year veteran of the Oprah Winfrey Show, where as senior supervising producer, he produced shows on a variety of topics. He is a former national reporter for the Atlanta Constitution and for the Greensboro News and Record. He's worked as a consultant for CBS King World, has created and produced a show for the Discovery Network, written for Preservation Magazine, Chicago Tribune, New York Times, and is currently finishing up a feature-length documentary, in between hearing me moan about my book tour blues, which takes more time than making a documentary, really. And finally, Carole Chouinard has worked in television talk show genre for over 30 years, beginning as a researcher on NBC's Tomorrow program, hosted by the late Tom Snyder. She then joined the staff of the daytime program Our Magazine, before moving into late-night TV, working on the Arsenio Show for its 5.5-year run. She received 2 Emmy nominations for her work as producer on ABC's Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher, and served as a producer for the first season of HBO's Real Time for Bill Maher. After producing CNBC's Dennis Miller program, Carole is now senior producer for Tavis Smiley on PBS. She's worked with publishers and authors since the beginning of her career. I don't know how you could do it. and over the years has added booking politicians, journalists, and newsmakers to her expertise. So, I think since David Ulin is the book editor of the LA Times, maybe I should give you the hardest time to begin with and ask you this question. Is it true that nobody's publishing books?
There are, I think it's patently untrue that more books are being published now than ever before. What are the latest numbers? Like 175,000 books are being published in the United States every year. That includes textbooks and whatever. But we're getting about 200 books a day at the Times Book Review. So I can safely say that many people are publishing books.
And yet what you hear from publishers and from agents and from publicists and all of that is that nobody's buying any books. That, you hear from publishers, that they're only publishing 6 novels a year. And so where is the disconnect?
Well, I think a lot of people are publishing books. I don't know how many people are actually buying books, although I think a lot of people are buying books. I think the publishing industry, to be perfectly frank, is over-publishing, and the publishing industry is sort of, like most businesses, is trying to expand a market that may not be expandable. So I think too many books are being published. How those books are selling, to be perfectly honest, I don't pay that much attention to that because my focus is really on covering the books and having books reviewed and creating a critical conversation about books. And I try and keep my attention on that and don't spend a lot of time thinking about how and where the books are selling. You'd have to talk to a publishing industry consultant about what the numbers are, but I think there are certainly vast numbers of books being published.
So that's the good news. And there may be that there are too many books getting published, so that may be the bad news. Now, you guys get books submitted all the time, right? Every day. Do you notice that the quality of books has improved or declined or stayed the same? And quality, as in, what we hear, writers, is that nobody wants quality, but publishers want something that makes money. And it doesn't matter how well written or badly written it is, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that's something that sells. I mean, do you notice that things are getting better or worse?
I probably get about 5 to 10 books a day. And to answer your question, I don't notice any decline in the quality of books. Maybe because, and I deal with all the major publishers and a lot of the university presses, and so the university presses especially don't publish poor quality stuff. I mean, I do feel like I get my share of books that are off the mark, and sometimes we get just sort of tawdry pop fiction or something that is really not anything we do on the show. But I don't, to make a general statement, I don't see any wholesale decline in quality of what's being published. I mean, I really don't.
That's a lot of repetition. I probably get between what you guys get. I'm probably about 50 to 100 books a week. And if I had a $5 bill for every book that told me the secret for how to be happy, it's sort of a couple of years ago, somebody came out with a definitive book on how to accrue happiness, and then all of a sudden, everybody's got a happy book. It's either got a yellow cover or an aqua cover or a pink cover, a smiley face in there somewhere, or a little halo. There's a bunch of them, and it's kind of like movies in a way. When you get this one particular kind of movie, this everybody dies in the end, sort of really deep, nihilistic movie, then there's a feel about it. The next year, that's what made money, and that's what people are interested in. I don't know if people buy them because there's so much of it on the shelves, or whether there's so much of it on the shelves because they hope people will buy it. But you can definitely see some genres that they're really sharpening.
So what's the genre nowadays? Where are you getting
I get a lot of war books.
Oh, yeah.
The amount of money they were spending on the war, the sort of concentric effect of war in society, a lot of war memoirs about people who had served and who are, interestingly enough, still serving. It's like, oh, you're going to publish this and then go back and go to work and everything's going to be okay. So there's a lot of that. People are interested.
But the flip side, I think, is that, you know, we saw those happiness books too. And then somebody published a defense of melancholy, of unhappiness. And I have great sympathy for melancholy and unhappiness, so we reviewed that book. So it made me happy that somebody else was unhappy.
Are you kidding? There's a whole room full of unhappy people. That's
so what I mean is, I think that you can, you know, that, and again, I mean, I don't think you necessarily, I hope, you as a writer, you're not necessarily thinking when you're writing about how the book is positioned, but if your book cuts against the grain of all that repetition, I agree, the same thing with the war books. There are tons of war books, and many of them are relatively generic and repetitious, but then there are those that aren't, and so the ones that aren't end up sort of having a higher, sticking out higher, and having a higher profile because you're so happy to see something that cuts against the grain.
What I wanted to add is that what we've seen since last year and on into this year too is religion and politics. I mean, we've all seen those books. And there are probably a dozen books out on the connection between religion and politics and what that was about. And then there's some that are more angry than others. And the other books that have started to come out this year, but I suspect they're really going to hit next year, are the Bush books. More of these, you know, just the look back in the Bush years.
Sort of the analysis of the
Right. Jacob Weisberg has one out now, and then there's another one coming out about how he served at the Justice Department, or justice was in the Bush years. But I just think...
And eventually he'll write his own memoirs, because they all...
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. Lots of little short words in it.
Yeah. Big advance, and... But anyway, it's religion and politics that we've been seeing a whole lot of.
And the year before it was the monument, was sort of the look at parenting and sort of why I like my $300,000 job to be a stay-at-home mom, or how we're doing this with our kids. And then there were a couple of books that did that against the grain thing, where they said, well, if you're a real woman, you dropped out for the mom track, you're screwed, done, gone. And so that there was a lot of conversation around both the genres.
Well, so what is the actual physical, I mean, it's maybe a good place to start. The physical process, you get 200 books a day, you said?
Something like that, yeah.
Oh my God. Okay. So if he doesn't review you for your next book, it's not his fault. And what is the physical process? How many did you get a book?
Thousands, weekly. And I think what's most helpful to people that are trying to promote their book, which is, I imagine we have a lot of writers here, is to separate nonfiction and nonfiction, and to try to really gear your book to the audience that is most likely, the television program, the radio program, the newspaper market, that is most likely to buy it. For example,
Gear as in writing to that, or
no, I'm talking about publishing.
Pitching.
Right. I can't tell you. There was a period at the Oprah Winfrey Show where we hadn't done cooking in 3 years, and there were still publicists and authors that would teach us books. And we're not cooking this year. Watch our show. We're not cooking now. Sometimes they cook now, sometimes they don't. But I don't think Tavis cooks with any frequency. So to pitch a cookbook to the Tavis Smiley Show or the Oprah Winfrey Show when they're on a year where they're not cooking doesn't make any sense.
But don't you find that lots of times they just sort of throw it all up against the wall and say, well, by the grace of God, something will stick.
Yeah,
right, which is not helpful, I think.
Right, because
you are very busy. Yeah.
It's expensive for the author because lots of times the author gets charged for the books that go out in promo. So if they're indiscriminately sending to everybody, and there's really this niche that would be most interested in your book, then you're paying for books that are going to get put on the freebie shelf.
Yeah, I mean, what you say is so true. And if you're, I'd say, fortunate enough to have a book publicist,
Or unfortunately not so.
Well, yeah.
You notice there's no publicist on the panel? I have to say, you know why? It's because I want you to feel free to say anything bad you want to say about publicists. And I know David Boul has a couple of things to say about them. I invite you. Other publicists.
Well, I mean...
There are publicists, but we've heard it all.
Yes. I get a lot of books pitched to me by publicists that are clearly, like David said, books we would not do. Exercise, health, lifestyle, fitness sort of thing, relationships, dating, and
Happiness.
Happiness. It's a waste of my time because then I've gotten it unsolicited. Then someone follows it up with phone calls or emails, and you think, well, how hard is it to answer an email? Well, if you have other things to do and you're on deadline, and I didn't ask for the book anyway, why do I have to explain to you that an exercise book is not good for us? And so I've developed a sort of, kind of terse reply that my colleagues say is sort of nasty, really. But I just say, look at our website. If you don't watch the show, look at our website and see the guests that we book. We focus on news and politics. We don't, and it really, at the end of the day, then you've got we all, I'm sure, have offices filled with books. And, we do book giveaways and all that other kind of stuff. But know your audience. And I mean, if I had one conversation, I've had dozens with publicists who say, I don't know what to do with this author. They want to be on Oprah. And their book is so clearly nothing Oprah would be interested. It's like, it doesn't fit.
But wait, David, don't you have stories? What was that guy who called you every day for 3 years, and every day you said, absolutely not, don't ever call me back. And then now he's a superstar because...
It was in his biography anyway, spill.
No. I think to spin the conversation slightly, I think there's nothing wrong with being your own publicist. And I know, everyone's different, and every producer's different, every editor's different. But I was always delighted to hear from an author themselves who called and said, I wrote this book about such and such. Because I think you can be your own best salesperson. And I'm a dear friend of Gina's, and I think she's probably the best writer in Los Angeles right now. And I've encouraged Gina to be her own publicist because I think nobody sells Gina's books like Gina does. She's read them. I can't tell you how many hundreds and hundreds of publicists I've spoken with that didn't read the book they're pitching.
Yeah.
So if you're in the position of on the receiving end of a phone call from someone that hasn't taken the time to read what they're pitching, you get kind of frustrated. So anyway, I was trying to...
Because they get 100 books a month, and so you can't read them.
Sure, but you can't. But anyway, I was just saying that I was trying to spin it positively, saying that I would suggest that people hear that that you can learn the skills to pitch yourself at various levels. It might be hard to pitch yourself to the Los Angeles Times or to a national television program, but you can start small and work your way up, and I think you can be successful.
Okay, but let's see, David, if a author calls you, and first of all, you don't answer your phone, right?
I never answer my phone.
Okay. And you have an LA Times.
I'm the bad guy on the panel. I honestly, I never answer my phone. I don't return publicist phone calls unless I'm interested in the book, and I don't return publicist emails unless I'm interested in the book. For the precise reasons that Carol's saying, that's my terse, nasty response. And the publicists who know me, and I've done this for a long time, so there are a lot of publicists I know, and there are a lot of publicists with whom I have good working relationships. They know that I'll respond when I'm interested, and they're certainly welcome to pitch me. I look at the pitches. I actually do look at every single book. I personally look at every single book that comes in because I feel like, because I'm a junkie and that's my drug of choice, so I need the fix at the end of the day. But also because I feel like I don't want something to slip between the cracks that I'm not seeing. And in the end, I'm the editor. I work with a bunch of other editors, but at the end of the day, I'm the person who's responsible. So my other editors look through the books too, and we talk about the books, but I lay eyes on every book that comes in. But it is an enormous amount of time. There's an enormous amount of work that goes into running the section, both in terms of assigning pieces and putting the section together and getting stuff up, and also all the logistics. And I don't have time to respond to every sort of generic publicist pitch that comes in. The big issue for me are the publicists who don't know the publication or don't know kind of what our editorial focus is and just assume that because we're a newspaper, or particularly a newspaper in Los Angeles, that certain books will automatically be what we cover. That's a big issue. But I find it awkward personally to hear from writers, because the volume of books that we get as compared with the space that we have to review, we're doing 20 to 25 books a week. So out of 200 a week out of 1,000 a week that we get, that's a minuscule proportion, and it's very difficult to explain that to a writer who calls you. So I prefer not to hear from writers. I think it's easier, and as a writer, I prefer to have a publicist. Or as a writer, I do prefer to have a publicist sort of be the intermediary for me. That's just my preference. I think it depends on sort of your personality and the personality of the person you approach.
I think that's a lesson. Well, I think that's a lesson that we've just illustrated right here. I did not look at a tenth of the books that came my way, but I answered every phone call. If you called me, I called you back. So I didn't look at the book, but I took a phone call from anyone that ever called me.
So what were you calling them back to say if you haven't seen the book?
If they called me, I was returning their call. And if they want to pitch me, then I'll give them 30 seconds or 15 seconds or as much time as I have, depending if I have 300 phone calls that day or 2, or 20. But David wasn't taking his phone calls, but he was looking carefully at every single book. I didn't look at the books. I didn't, that was, to me, it was easier. That's just my preference. So I guess the point that I would hope that people would take home with them is there are no rules, because some people prefer to take a phone call and some people don't. Some people want an email and some people don't. And here's an email person. So don't call her, send her an email. Don't send me a book. Don't send him a book. And everybody's different. So
I think you two should work together.
Can I say something? What I've felt through my career is my working relationship is actually with the book publicists and not with the authors. I'll see the author once, maybe, and maybe see them again at some point when I work on another show, but I work with those book publicists for years, and I feel like, I have friendships now with a lot of the book publicists that began simply as business relationships, and there are people that I trust what they're sending me. And I trust that they wouldn't send me somebody, they wouldn't waste my time. Now, I do feel like we walk a fine line on our show, because I do get calls occasionally from the authors, but then I always ask them, well, who is your publisher? Have you been assigned a publicist? And if I know the person, the publicist, I tend to call them and say, hey, your author called me. Blah, 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 and we talk about it, and they'll say, yeah, she's really aggressive, but she's this and that or whatever.
Also, it's a bad thing that the author calls. They have to apologize for it.
No, they don't have to apologize for it, but it's just, sometimes it's kind of protocol, because the author doesn't think the publicist is doing their job. The publicist is actually doing their job. They've sent the book, they're giving it a time for you to review the book, or they know that, look, I sent you the book, I know it's not something you do, but the author loves Tavis or loves, fill in the blank, and so they wanted me to send it, so I sent it, so I could say, I sent it. But I do have, there was one author who started calling me saying that he had a new book coming out, and to make a long story short, we ended up doing it. And he's was an economics professor at a college in Pittsburgh. He retired, and he and his wife decided to travel all around the country. He living frugally and stuff. And so the book is called Cheap Motels and a Hot Plate, because being an economist, they ended up making this sort of anecdotal study of their own as to what it was like to be a working class American, because they would take minimum wage jobs if they wanted to stay someplace 2 months. And you know, so people would hire them to work as a waiter or hostess in a restaurant, not knowing that this guy has a PhD and his wife was very well educated as well. So he ended up writing a book about their experiences, and that was real interesting. I didn't get pitched that from a publicist, I got pitched that from him. So, you know, you're right, there are no rules. I can't say I never talked to authors because I did, and you know, and this was really good, and I wouldn't have gotten it from a publicist. So,
okay, so here's, I think for writers in fiction and nonfiction, I think they're always, you know, we have an idea of what happens once the book gets into the publisher's hands. But to give a real sort of practical view of what happens, the truck dumps the books in your office every day.
I have a book room, it's not in my office.
I'm sorry?
There's a room, we call it the book room. It's full of
that's like the morgue, right?
No, I prefer to think of it as the...
Where books go to die.
No, it's not. That's actually, I mean, we're painting a really negative portrait of it, but it's not at all. It's actually, it's the room of hope.
Happiness. Okay, so seriously, what happens then?
Well, a couple things. First, I just want to touch on one thing, which is just to spin off something Carole was saying. There are publicists who I have also developed long-term working relationships with, who I trust, and I listen to everything they say. I don't always review the books they pitch, but they're not pitching me everything. I know they're going to tell me the truth. They're going to say, I don't think this book is right for you, but the author wanted me to send it, or I really think you ought to look at this book, and I will take that really seriously because I have a long-term history with those people and a history of them steering me in interesting directions or introducing me to things. So that's the first
Are
thing.
these publicists who work for houses or independent ones?
A little bit of both. I mean, most of the publicists I deal with work for houses, but I also deal with independent publicists who I trust. There are also publicists who I frankly don't trust at all, and when they call, I know I almost can guarantee you that they're pitching me the wrong stuff.
Can you please make a list at the end of this evening? Don't you want to know if $50,000 is going to the right or the wrong publicist?
But as far as what happens with the, you know, with the books when they come in, we're obviously, and then, I mean, you know, you have to be aware of the newspaper, a newspaper book section has a certain sort of purview, and part of it has to do with literature and part of it has to do with the newspaper. So on the one hand, we're trying to have a conversation. I'm very interested in literary fiction and literary nonfiction. I'm very interested in independent publishers. I'm very interested in finding good, new, first-time writers. But I also, as part of the newspaper, am very interested in covering things like Samantha Power or Robert Draper's book on Bush, or the Jacob Weisberg book, for instance, or the George Tenet book, or the Bob Woodward books. So I think for the paper, it breaks down into two things. One is sort of the book as news, or the book off the news, and the other is the more kind of literary, enduring conversation. And so what we'll do is, you know, there are obvious choices that we're going to make. Those newsworthy books, we're obviously going to review books by big writers, you know, in terms of what's coming down the pike. You know, David Hadu, who wrote Positively Fourth Street and Lush Life, has a new book out about the comic scare in the 50s. You know, he's an important writer. In fact, we're reviewing that book this Sunday. But once you sort of get through the obvious choices books, and then about half the books we get are books that we would never review. Self-help books, inspirational books, business books, health and fitness books, diet and
What about
cookbooks.
self-published?
Self-published books at the moment we don't do, simply because we don't have a real adequate way of vetting them, and too many of them are vanity productions that are just not worth our time. I wouldn't mind being able to look at them more closely, but I just don't have the staff to do it. So at the moment, we're not looking at self-published books. But then we have a chunk of books, besides, say, the obvious choice books, and then the big chunk of books that we're not going to look at. We have a group of books that are possibilities, and then how those get selected depends on a variety of factors. It depends on what the mix is for the week, how much fiction we have, how much nonfiction we have, how many books on certain issues or subjects we have, what kind of variety we want, because we want a variety in the Sunday section. And we also do the daily reviews, so we want a variety of books through the daily. And then if there's a writer that one of us is particularly interested in or has been looking at, or if there's a press that we think is really good and does interesting stuff that we might keep an eye out for. If we're putting together an issue that has some kind of theme to it, or if there's a way in which we have a book in place, a review in place, and this other review seems to fit with it so that we can get a nice sort of 2-page spread or something like that, we'll pick books that way. And then also, and then I'll end this long monologue.
That's good.
The other thing that we do sometimes is we will occasionally review a book that we would ordinarily not review if we have the right writer to write about it. And a recent example of that is in December, I think it was Hap Mifflin published a book of aerial photographs taken from planes. You could sort of map your airplane route across the United States. So this is the kind of novelty. It's probably more than a novelty book. It doesn't do it justice to call it a novelty book, but it's not the kind of book that we would normally do. But about a month before, we had run a review of Will Self's book, Psychogeography, which is about place and walking. And that book opens with a long essay that Self wrote about, quote unquote, walking from London to New York. He walked from his house to Heathrow Airport, flew to Kennedy, and then walked from Kennedy to Manhattan. And
he wrote a book about that?
He wrote, it's about a 50-page essay that opens this book. And he wrote really interestingly about the phenomenon of flying. So I sent Will Self an email and said, okay, what do you think? And he said, great. And he wrote this really wonderful, hilarious essay, sort of reviewing the book, but kind of spinning off of the book. That was a great piece for us to have. Now, we would have, as I say, if we hadn't had someone like that to write a piece or to use that book as a kind of launching pad for some kind of piece of writing, we would have never reviewed that book. But as it turned out, it was, I think, one of the more successful pieces we published last year.
Can I just say before I move on to the others that there's something inherently unfair about a guy getting published, writing about walking from Kennedy home, and the rest of us are writing like 10 years of historical novels, big dynasties. Seriously, I mean, there's
He's just better at gaming the system.
Little, of course, yeah. Okay. So how do you pick, or what happens? Is there somebody who vets them before you get them?
No, I'm the person who ends up doing it. I've got this big post open several times a day. I walk over to it, and there's always books in it. I thought when I first started doing this job that that's something really supposed to happen, to have all the books you ever wanted sort of appear. And then after the second or third week, I started to feel like Mickey and the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Water kept coming and coming and coming. God forbid you should go away for a conference for 3 or 4 days, or be sick for a week because you come back and there's like 4 bins all tottering up like this with my initials, and the receptionist is getting a little snarly saying, "There's nothing else that can fit in here. These need to be moved." So usually what I do is I try to take some time during almost every day to open them up and sort of put them out on a table and kind of look at them. And I kind of do the same thing that you do. I mean, you know that, the cabbage and grapefruit diet is not going to end up being a story unless the lady, kills 3 people in one of them. Henry Kissinger or something. Yeah. But in general,
the cabbage or the grapefruit that kills?
Yeah. There are some things that, I'm perverse, when I get a note from a publicist saying, "This is the next Charles Dickens," because it just feels like more hype. It's like, let me decide if he's the next Charles Dickens. I do rely, as you guys do, publicists with whom I have established a relationship who kind of know not so much my taste, because I look at a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily my taste, but that I think NPR listeners would find interesting, but sort of has an ear for what some of the shows are and how different the shows are from each other, and what they'll tolerate, what they won't, what they're really curious about. For instance, anybody out there happens to be writing a book on opera. Robert Siegel, at All Things Considered, is an opera freak. He loves opera. He knows more about opera than any living person I've ever met, I think. And that's what Placido Domingo said, so I'm taking his word for it. So I got a book, and I think you guys reviewed it, several months ago about the Wagner Plan, who, talk about your soap opera. Well, and I sort of looked and said, I'm not a Wagner nut, but it just looked like it had possibilities for some reason. And the more I kind of looked through it and the crazier it got, I thought, it's not straight opera, but it is biography, and it's one hell of a family food fight, and maybe Robert would be interested in this. So I sent him a note and said that, this is really more up your alley than mine, but I think that maybe, someone pitched that to me a couple of months ago. I meant to take a look at it, and I didn't, but because you looked at it and you thought it might be me, I'm going to take a look at it. So he's still looking at it. I don't know if he's going to end up doing it. It's a political year. He's occupied with other stuff, but lots of times a colleague will say, I think this show might be interested in, I think this might have an ongoing, and that's sort of what we do. So I try to do this triage, things to keep for myself, things to pass on to other colleagues, either because I can't do them or because I know that they're things that they're interested in and that they'd like to have, give them right of first refusal. And then there's stuff that is never, ever, it's just not. And even when you talk to people who are recommending books, and you say, we don't really do stories on Pilates, so I don't waste.
What about fiction, though?
A Pilates book. Fiction is trickier because, sometimes you can't judge a book by its cover. And sometimes you can. So it's really, I try to scan the first chapter of a lot of what I get to see, whether it grabs me, how I feel about it, whether, the level of authenticity I think is coming from the author, and then I may put it aside and read the whole thing. I'm sure I don't read really as much as you guys do, but I probably read about 4 books a year.
Oh my God.
I say I don't watch television anymore.
But you do fiction? Do you look for a non-fiction angle in the fiction?
The best conversations I've had since coming to NPR was with Kazuo Ishiguro, wrote about The Remains of the Dead, where we talked on mic for maybe half an hour for a 10-minute piece.
Before the movie, after the movie?
I'm sorry, it wasn't The Remains of the Day, it was Never Let Me Go. And we were sort of talking about this sort of still internal life of a lot of his characters and how growing up in England sort of affected him as an author. And it got really into a lot of really interesting things that they turned into, at NPR we're discovering what we have. And so we're starting to do a lot of web extras, web build-outs, and we're realizing that, if we have a show that's an hour long and we've got 6 10-minute pieces or 10 6-minute pieces, there's sometimes great tape that you don't get to use, and so we have ended up sort of re-editing some of these things and putting them on the web so that people can hear sort of the conversation in context and more of the funny stuff that you might have missed. So we do fiction.
Yeah. So David, how do people get their books on the Oprah clock?
I'm not working at Oprah anymore, so I don't know what they're doing this week. But when I was there
last week,
well, I think it's probably more helpful to offer up that I think that television shows have systems in place, and the systems change depending on the personalities. Because I've worked at other shows as well, and people always ask me. Here's a good specific thing that you and I have talked about, Gina, and that is, if you're watching the credits of the television program, the Today Show, Tavis, Smiley, Oprah Winfrey, whatever the show is, and you see there are lots of people who are listed as producer or senior producer, can you send your book to more than one of them? Or can you send it to all of them? Or should you just send it to the senior? Or should you just send it to the executive producer? And, every show works differently. And what's going on in 2006 at the Today Show may change in 2009. And Good Morning America may be sending all the books one way, and then 4 years from now they may put them somewhere else. So I always advise people to send your book to more than one person at the show. They'll deal with it. If they're going to reject you, they're going to reject you. But when I was at the Oprah show, there were 7 or 8 producers, and each one of them got their own sets of books. And sometimes a publicist would send 8 copies of the book to 8 different people, and sometimes there was somebody had a personal relationship and they just sent it to one person. And sometimes the book was addressed to Oprah, and sometimes the book was addressed to Matt Lauer.
well, supposing you get a book, you got a book, and it looked interesting. Do you have to read it first, or they just hand it over to
every case is different. It depends. It depends if the producer, editor, writer is looking for an idea or not. If you need an idea because you have a show, you have a hole, then you're more likely to spend a little bit more time. If you've got every single slot filled in your newspaper, television program, radio program for the next month, it's going to be a lot harder for you to think about something that you're going to do 6 weeks down the road. So it's timing, which doesn't help somebody that's trying to pitch a book because they don't know on the outside what's going on. If you're looking for an idea, you'll spend a hell of a lot more time reading, paging through. You know, if there's someone you know, a decent publicist has recommended it, a friend, a colleague. If you, a lot of times we were talking about this at dinner earlier. A lot of times the way the gravy train works, or I don't know if that's the right expression, but television feeds off print. So there's nothing a television producer likes more than to see a book review, favorable or unfavorable, in the Los Angeles Times, or a transcript from NPR, or something that somebody else has already taken the risk and said, "Wow, this is hot right now because everybody else is doing it. Look, you know, we've got 6 or 7 newspaper reviews. This is hot. Let's go for this." And I think that's so. If you know, once you hit pay dirt, use that to try to get.
So if you get a review, take it and fax it over to the editor of to producers. Yeah, does that work?
Absolutely. That, you know, you try anything. You know, anything works. Some things work for you know, some things work sometimes, but that is something that I think works frequently. That probably doesn't work for you.
Well, no, but there's a variation which I was going to mention, which is freelancers, because almost, you know, newspaper book sections, mine certainly, and pretty much all of them are largely freelance written. They're one of the last sort of bastions of freelance work in newspaper, and it's tricky from an editor's point of view to take pitches from freelancers who you don't know. Similar deal with publicists. But I do take pitches from freelancers who I know and who I trust and who I work with. And I have certainly assigned books that I missed, that didn't cross my radar screen, because a freelancer who I've worked with for a long time, who's, again, his sensibility or opinion or aesthetics I trust, pitched me the book, and I took the pitch. And so sometimes it's possible to sort of backdoor your way into a newspaper that you might not be able to get in through the front door. And in the same way that David says, it's more often happening when we've got a hole. If something falls out, or if we've got a hole, or something's coming up, and I need I've got a slot that needs to be filled, I am looking for pieces, I'm looking for books, and if someone pitches me the right book at that moment, it'll get in, whereas at a different period of time, it might not.
Well, do you ask, I'm not being facetious, do you ask the freelancer, is this a friend of yours, or is this a person you dislike particularly, or does it matter? I mean, somebody asks, I'd like to review this book. So,
you mean how I draw the freelance, how I build the freelance pool?
No, I call you and I'm a freelancer, and I say, "Oh, John Updike's stuff."
Oh yeah, no, I've got all that stuff. That's what I'm saying. That's why I don't take pitches from freelancers I don't know, because I'm wary of the conflict of interest stuff. The freelancers who I do take pitches from are freelancers who contribute to me on a regular basis, who I've worked with for a long time, whose integrity I trust, and even then, I always vet every assignment by asking. I mean, I'll do it when I assign a book too. I always say to a reviewer, do you know this person? Have you met this person? Do you have a grudge against this person? Is there any axe to grind, no matter how small? And my favorite response was, one reviewer said to me, I don't know if I can review this book because it's published by Knopf, and Knopf rejected my last novel.
This is like
so I said, right, so I said, and then the question comes, the real question is, can you review the book? I mean, for some people, the fact that Knopf rejected their novel would be a deal breaker. For other people, it wouldn't be, and I think then you get into the kind of personal ethics and morality of the review.
They knew the author. You know, the writing world is relatively small.
Yeah,
you get this question, do you know the author? It's like, yeah, I know a whole bunch of authors. I don't go hanging out with them on Saturday night, but sure.
If they've met the author, I don't have an issue. If they've interviewed the author like a long time ago, I don't have an issue. If they have, David Freeman once said to me, David Freeman once said that the conflict of interest rule is if you had a meal one-on-one with them, then you're out. And also, for me, it does matter, like, as another example, I won't say who it is, but I once wanted to review a book, and I was going to interview the writer. And I talked to an editor I work with and said, what do you think? I was going to do a public interview with the writer, and I talked to this editor and said, what do you think? I want to review this book. And he said, see what happens with the interview and decide afterwards. And I went and did the interview with this writer, and I detested this person so much on a personal level. I will not say that I could not, in good conscience, review the book, which I actually liked, because I had such a visceral reaction to the person that by the time I was finished talking to them, I no longer liked the book, and so I had to recuse myself from reviewing that book. So I think it really is a sort of, again, there are no rules. You have to be very aware of those kind of ethical considerations, both as a writer and also as an editor. And you have to ask those questions, because if you don't ask them, you won't get the answer.
Well, does it help? You know what publicists make you do? They have you write your own press release, you know, a little blurb on the jacket, but they also want you to write an actual press release, as in the importance of this book, and then talking points, and then relevant questions, and then find a non-fiction
That's because they don't
angle.
read the book.
Say that again?
That's because they can't read the book.
Well, no, they do that to send out to you guys, because they're assuming that you don't read the book, or that if I spoon-feed you a non-fiction angle from the novel, then you might actually give it some consideration, whereas if I say, you know, I've got a collection of short stories about, you know, ducks, they're not going to want, but if there's like a non-fiction angle about ducks, then you might want to, you know, so...
But lots of times it is the most tenuous stretch. Oh, you'll be really interested in this piece of fiction because blah, and it's like it's got nothing to do with what it's supposed to tie in.
Yeah, but when you open
what
the press
peg
kit, does it help when you see the stuff? Is it any good? Should you spend time doing that stuff, or is
Well,
it useless?
I mean, I don't read the press material. I don't know it. I mean, what I do is I look to see if there's an author tour schedule. Because the first thing I want to know, more than anything else, is are they going to be in LA? Because our preference is always to have guests in studio. And if someone is, by very nature of the book, a foreigner, then and if they're not going to even be in the country, my question is, why are you sending me this book?
But if you book them, the publisher will send them. Publishers
Not
are waiting to see
necessarily.
if it's worth their...
Not necessarily. Well, I mean, if you had Oprah or if you have 60 Minutes interested or, you know, a huge show, but someone isn't going to, you know, it costs money. And so they're not going to send someone simply for the Tavis Smiley show on PBS. But I think that, you know, I go through the publicity material once I'm more into the process, but I tend to look at the book itself, and I do read a lot too, and I'll go through a lot of the book. I won't say I'll read it cover to cover, but I'll go through that book and go back and forth with the publicist. Probably before I'll look at the, you know, I might look at the bio of the person, but I do my own background material on the book, and so to me, unless a publicist, unless there's like an interview with the author that I tend to pull out and put in the research packet, I do my own background material on the person. Usually, I don't say all the time, but usually I do a pre-interview with the author. So I have my own notes, and I have my own thought about what that book and what that author has to share with Tavis that will be relevant to our show, and that, you know, might particularly pique his interest. And so I feel like I rarely, if ever, use the press material that's sent along.
Yeah, I mean, I never use the questions that they suggest that you ask, because I figure if I'm going to talk to the author, I'm going to read your book, because it would just be really unfortunate to talk to you without having read your book. And so if I'm reading your book, I kind of know what I want to ask you.
Although I would say, sometimes I read those questions, I don't know, in press packets for books, a lot of times the publicist or perhaps the author will, but anyway, it's sample questions for the author. And
They make us do that.
but what I think is 9 times out of 10, and I don't want to malign local television producers or local radio producers or whatever, but I think 9 times out of 10, those people use those questions. And so those are specifically the questions I don't want to ask the author, because that is what they've been asked everywhere else. And a lot of times with authors who are on a book tour, LA is one of their final stops. So they've done all of these interviews, some of them national. We already know this story about something, something, something. There's no way we're going to talk about it on our show. I need something different, and that's what I have to talk to the author for. That's my situation.
Well, so you think you're an unknown writer and you have a collection of short stories and it doesn't have a political or non-fiction angle, right?
You're screwed.
Okay, that was the good news, you guys.
How about the Brian Lamb book? But he only does it. Okay, that shows off the air.
No, okay, we have like.
I look at those books.
You do, huh?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we do a lot of fiction.
You got to get every single tonight.
That's fine. I mean, we do a lot of fiction. We purposely do a lot of fiction because increasingly, I think newspapers and Sunday book sections don't do a lot of fiction, and I think that fiction is important, and we ought to do a lot of fiction. I read a lot of fiction, and I look for. Like I said before, I mean, we may not give vast amounts of coverage to first-time fiction writers or first-time short story writers, but I think that it's an important part of the cultural conversation, and we give it the space that we can.
Well, when the show that I work on is really kind of a non-fiction show. However, we do fiction very rarely. It tends to be a name author. John Updike, Jane Smiley, Gina.
That's the biggest. Forget Updike, you know.
But I will say, and I'm thinking of 3 authors in particular that we booked on our show that were fiction writers, and I had heard about them months in advance from their book publicists, who were, once again, people I trusted, who said, you really need to read this book. This person is going to be the next star, whatever. One was Danao Mengestu. Yeah, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears. One was Juno Diaz, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde.
Oscar Diaz.
Oscar Diaz. No, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde. Juno Diaz.
Juno Diaz.
And then the other one was by an African author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. It was called The Wizard of the Crow, and I thought that was one of the best books I've read in years. And he's a literature professor at UC Irvine. And this is a man who came with, I mean, you could talk to him for 3 hours about his life in Kenya. It reads like a book. It's so extraordinary. And then you read this book, and it's filled with magical realism, and it was just wonderful, and those are 3 things I remember taking, where if you get a lot of books in, you have to pick your battles. We can't pitch everything, even if we think it might be good. You just can't schedule every author. You can't do it, and so sometimes it's a real almost heartbreak. You think like, gosh, I can only push this so far, and now I've got to pull back because I've got to fight for something else, or I've got to look for something else.
See, what I want is to figure out seriously how to sort of unscrew the short story collection writing. So we want to figure out what can we do to help that short story collection writer or the person who's not from Africa. I mean, not everybody's born in Kenya, and so on. So what to do? Let me just throw a couple of things at it and tell me, does it make a difference or not? Because these are all battles that we keep having to fight with our publishers, right? Does it matter? I mean, not if you're Jane Smiley, but does the cover matter? Should we lose sleep over whether or not my book's going to get any attention because the cover's awful?
But you can't control the cover anyway.
Oh, yes, you can. No, you can. Sure you can.
Oh, I beg to differ.
You mean the author can't control the cover?
No. The publisher sort of, I mean, lots of times the person who does the cover for your book is somebody who's never read the book. They're given like a two-sentence synopsis by. And you've had a very lucky experience, because I'll tell you, I've interviewed tons of people, and actually it's also happened to me where they just said, well, this is sort of how we see it.
Okay, but I mean, supposing that you can't, does it matter what the cover looks like? Say you get a galley, does it matter if the galley's printed with the actual cover, which indicates the publisher spent money on the galley? You don't know.
The cover only matters, I think, in terms of the bookstore. I mean, I do think that there's how it's placed, and one of my books, I really dislike the cover, and the publisher said to me, imagine it on the frontlist table. Imagine walking into a bookstore and seeing it from 40 feet away. And he was right. I didn't like the cover any better, but he was right. It didn't matter in terms of whether, I don't imagine it mattered in terms of reading the coverage or how the book worked in the media. But in terms of the bookstore, it made a difference. But those are two different things.
I was just going to say, what matters more in the world of television is this was odd to me because I was a print reporter for 10 years, then I switched to television. But I remember my first week in television, we were sitting around a pitch meeting, producers were talking, and somebody brought something up, and the executive producer said, well, can they talk? I'm like, what do you mean, can they? Of course they can. No, if there's an expression, whether they can talk or not. Are you entertaining? Television, radio, you have to be lively. A shy person, it's much harder for a television producer, a radio producer to book a shy person. Believe it or not, it's very sad, but it's harder to book an extremely elderly person because they talk slowly. And slow talkers don't make good television usually, especially live television. So,
what about?
Wait just a second. Because that was a point when I was thinking about tonight that I wanted to bring up. If you have never been on television before, do not try out on a national show. I am telling you, we all know one another. And if you go on a national show, if I take a chance on you and book you, and you really are horrible on TV, you can bet I'm going to call every person I know at other shows, or if, I'll get emails from friends of mine at other shows. Did you do so-and-so? Did you have this person? Did you? And I will say, they were horrible.
What's horrible? What's horrible?
Monosyllabic.
Monosyllabic?
Extreme hesitation. No energy.
Not knowing how to tell a story. So the host asked you a question and you said, yeah, that was really true.
And then they're and we're sort of and then that, and it's like,
it's not that easy to be the interviewed person, to be the interviewee on a television show. You might think you could do it, no problem. But trust me, you will be very, very nervous at the point where they take you out on the stage and all this stuff is going on and lights and things, and you don't know what everybody else is doing, and you meet the person who you've just seen on television before, who is just a regular person like you or I, but oh my gosh, there they are. Get yourself booked on a local television show first. You've got to do that. You have got to get experience first.
Right, if Bill Maher calls me and I haven't been on like ABC News in, I don't know,
he's going to eat you alive.
I'm going to turn him down and go to Irvine first?
You know what? I say you can Bill Maher at your own risk. Because I know he will chew you up and spit you out, and that is what people have seen nationally, is this author who did not know how to answer questions, they couldn't come back, and they couldn't spar with him.
The most important thing is it's not going to help you sell your book.
No.
It's not going to help you sell your book.
Which is actually what it's all about.
Yeah, you're better off not appearing.
Yeah.
Just because you get on the show doesn't mean that you're going to have increased book sales. I put thousands of people on television that did not sell books, but you can lead them out there, but you're on your own. If you can't do it, you can't do it, and there's an art to that as well.
Yeah, please, I beg of you, say to yourself, if you care about selling your book, go for media coaching. It helps. It really helps. You need to know how to answer questions. You need to know how to, you need to know when to expand on an answer and when not to, because, I mean, you need to be able to read the signals of the person who's doing the interview so you will know, cut to the chase, get to the point of your story. Time is everything in television, and if you're only going to get 4 minutes for an interview, which most of the interviews basically are. I mean, on Tavis, our interviews are 12 minutes long. And so we have another thought, which is, can this author and this subject matter fill 12 minutes? 12 minutes is not very long, but sometimes it can be eternity. You know, it's like, if the person is not a good talker. And,
is that why he was asking me about his Persian contract?
No. He actually likes his Iranian contractors.
I think another point that, at the risk of turning this into a lecture, trying to badger people, but trying to think of things that would be helpful. I think the authors that do the best on radio and television are ones that tease as opposed to giving it all away. If you give it away, nobody's going to run to Barnes & Noble and buy your book. They learned everything they ever wanted to know about happiness or whatever it is that the topic is. They saw it. They saw it on Today Show. They get it. They're not interested in buying the book anymore. You need to tease. What my book has 17 tips for how to do this. Here's one of them. Of course, you don't want to be a huckster because that kind of turns people off too. But if you suggest that there's more information there, if you want to go out and buy the book, that's usually helpful. Or if it's a fiction book, to give a set. This is an unbelievable mother and daughter story that goes through 6 dynasties, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but let me just say, your life will be changed forever, and your relationship with your mother will never be the same. It's a little bit more of a tease than going through and describing what actually is there.
But I would say though, for your short story writers, they almost need, what will sell them is a personal story. Because what are they going to do? Talk about each short story? I mean, I'm talking about radio or Tobias Wolff has a new book of short stories. It's his first book of short stories in a long time. We're going to book Tobias Wolff on the show. I mean, he's a very well-known author. He's not going to talk about each one of the short stories, but he's Tobias Wolff. If a well-known author writes a book of short stories, that's a different kettle of fish. But a not well-known writer writes a book of short stories, and what do they talk about? Well, let me ask you, why should someone interview them? What
because
about?
They need to sell the book. Why are we here?
No. But it's like you have to, as the author, I think you have to think of that yourself. You need a hook. And you need to think of it yourself. Is it something about your personal experience? Were you a quantum physicist, and then you decided you needed to write short stories about animals? I mean, something has got to give NPR a reason to talk to you.
There was a guy who was a CEO of something big deal, I forget what it was. And he got downsized or fired or something, and went home, and his marriage dissolved, and his kids weren't speaking to him.
He decided to go on happiness, really.
He decided to go work at Starbucks.
Yes.
And he said that, working at Starbucks, the first year he worked at Starbucks and became a barista, changed his life because it taught him for the first time how to interact with people, how to talk with people, how to anticipate people's needs. It was a little thin book, sort of everything I need to know. I learned while working at Starbucks or something. But I thought it was sort of interesting and quirky, and we might have done something with it, except by the time we saw it, because timing is everything, he'd been all over everywhere, because it was interesting enough and quirky enough that everybody picked it up and thought, well, he doesn't need us, we'll go on to an author who hasn't had quite that much exposure. But one of the most compelling pitches I ever got was, you opened it up and it said, by the time you read this author is dead, and I'm sending it to you as his publicist because it was published posthumously, and it was another one of these type A CEO types who found out he had a brain tumor and decided that he was going to, right then, it was inoperable, change the quality of his life and really stop and smell the roses and try to figure out what to do with the rest of the life. And he wanted to have a good death, which he, in the end, did, in fact, manage to do. His widow was touring with the book. But again, this was one of those situations where it was so unusual that by that time she'd been on Today, she'd been on a couple of other places, and I think when we got to NPR, they said, well, we see it everywhere. You know, what's there to talk about, what's there to add, and well, we love the idea that we don't want to look like the last person on Today.
I think that timing thing is really key also, which is that it is a time-sensitive industry, right? Newspapers, TV shows, radio, all media, it's time-sensitive. And so if we don't get to it, and because we're constantly making choices, if we don't get to it in a timely way, we're not going to get to it. So there's no point in sort of pitching it beyond its shelf life, as it were. Although the flip side from the newspaper point of view is that that's the kind of thing that also can help that small book of short stories, or the small press, or the independent publisher book, the book that's not getting a lot of coverage, which is a lot less time sensitive, and which then, whereas we would never run a review of, the new John Updike book 3 weeks late, because we'd get killed, both in-house and outside. We might well run a review of, a small first book of short stories a couple of months late, or I mean, we've run reviews of books 2 or 3 months, of those kind of books 2 or 3 months after their publication date, and so those books paradoxically have a bit of a longer kind of window of possibility in terms of how we might cover them, precisely because they're generally lower, or if not off, the cultural radar screen.
Do you guys get gimmicks when they pitch stuff to you? Somebody pitched a mystery set in the Vineyard once, and the UPS guy staggered and put this thing in. It was a wooden box with a bottle of wine in it.
Yeah, the authors dress up the parts and show up at your office sometimes. Seriously.
I haven't gotten anybody quite that far, but every now and then there's like little things that go in there, and the first thing that I think about as an author is, why do they spend that money? It's so expensive.
With the packaging, I think, my friend on the show who books all the celebrities, the film and TV actors, he gets tons of junk, little things to celebrate the new season, so they're, little gimmicky stuff. So his office is all filled with all this stuff, toys and things like that, tchotchkes. Sometimes it's creative packaging, but I do remember a book that I got that was filled, it was by an author who was Chinese American, and it was filled with like a scroll picture and a fan and all of the stuff which I thought was lovely, little gift box, but probably what would have been more helpful is a videotape or a DVD of the author on another show. So I could, let me see this person and see, because what am I going to do? Take this stuff into the executive producer, take it into the booking meeting, and say, well, they sent me a fan. They don't care. It's all about, will the person do a good interview? Is the person going to, connect with the host in a way that it's going to keep viewers watching the show, watching the interview?
Okay, let me pause a minute and see if there are questions here. I have more questions for you guys, but are there questions? We have a roving mic. Oh, the publicist asked the first question. Good for you. You realize you're in a dangerous kind of situation.
Tame lines.
Here, wait 1 second for Ebony to give you the...
It works? Okay. God help me, I am a publicist, and I've been sitting there nodding my head at just about everything you guys have been saying. The companies that I work for, NDM and Papercuts, they primarily publish graphic novels, and since those are fairly new in the world compared to other kinds of books, I'm wondering if there's anything particularly different or special that I should do to get attention for our books. We do both fiction and nonfiction.
I've done graphic novels. I mean, I usually do a couple of book lists a year, sort of books as gifts or just books to read over summer. And graphic novels have appeared on those lists from time to time.
Can I get your card?
I actually don't have one here with me, but
We do them also, and you know, and I generally, just as part of the mix, I don't believe philosophically in genre, really. I mean, I obviously believe in it, but because we cover everything across the board, I'm just looking for whatever makes the most interesting mix. And so we've done, you know, we put graphic novels on the cover. We've done small things with them. We put them, you know, we often will cover them when we have color pages because we can reproduce some of the art. And I'm also looking for ways, just with the section, to push the bounds and push the cultural recognition of what constitutes literature. So I'm really interested in forms. I'm particularly interested in popular forms that are evolving into art. So we look at a lot of graphic stuff for them.
I can't say that we do, but I was just trying to think if we've done any since I've been with the show. And I don't recall that we have, but that doesn't mean that we would never, or you know, that there's a policy against it. There isn't. I think it would depend on the subject matter and the author.
Ms. Lady?
How can we choose a good publicist?
Publicist?
Yeah, first question. The second question is, if this person is famous, they might not have time to read my book, but they are well established. And if they have time, they might not be so established, and you might not even take their phone calls.
David, come on.
I just think that I think it's really hard. I guess you just have to find somebody you have chemistry with. People ask, my friends who write books all the time ask me to recommend a publicist, and I don't have a name to give them because I just, you know, somebody may be good at cookbooks, and somebody might be good at music, and somebody might be good at up-and-coming authors, and somebody is good with short stories.
Yeah, but I think, no, but here's the thing, there are some publicists who are known for fiction and some who only do non-fiction, and there's different grades and all of that. But if Sandy Mendelssohn calls you and tries to push a book, or Lynn Goldberg calls and tries to push a book, does that impress you more than if it's, you know, Joe Schmo that you never heard of? Does it make a difference that you know these people are charging $20,000 and the other one's charging $3,000?
it depends on how good the pitch is. Sometimes it comes from a person who's acting as a publicist on behalf of a friend who's an author. They're not even
And you never heard of them?
They just, it depends on how good the pitch is.
And it depends on the book. Really, in the end, it depends on the book.
Yeah, I mean, I've had pitches from high-powered publicists at the agencies you mentioned, and you know, they were still just books we would not do. And I can say, because I know that, I'm like, you know, thanks very much, but you know, that's not what we do. You know, and
I don't think a publicist is going to be able to slip somebody on TV on a national television program, on any national television program. I mean, rarely. If the material doesn't stand alone, it's just not, there's too many.
Yeah, but you have 5 books.
There are too many
The material of which does stand alone. You have 5 books that are appropriate, say, for NPR, right? And they're represented, 3 of them by the in-house publicist, that was like a 20-year-old girl from, I don't know, Long Island. Most of them are, I don't know why. And then you have like these 2 other books that are by these really well-known, you know, high-priced publicists. Do you not differentiate? Do you not care who's doing the pitch? Or do you think, well, you know, if they pay that much, it must be
it's
something
about the book.
It's about the book.
It's totally about the book.
So pay the less. Pay less.
But what I do want to say, though, is there is something called the Publishers Publicity Association, the PPA, and it's basically in New York, but there's publicity associations of publicists out here as well, freelance publicists. So you know, access those organizations, and you know, and that's where you can start. Certainly, the Publishers Publicity Association, those are book publicists, and most of them, I think, are people who work at established publicity houses. But, and I'm sure my colleagues up here can vouch for this, in the last like 10 to 15 years, enormous amounts of people have left established publishing houses to go out on their own. And so, you know, you can also find I'm sure, my guess is they're also members of the Publishers Publicity Association, but you can start there. And they're book publicists.
But you know what? If your book has been published, if a publisher has published your book, they're going to assign a publicist to it. Now, that publicist will probably have 30 other books that she's got to work with, so you are not going to be her primary concern unless there's something really unusual about your book that's been tagged as the book equivalent of a, you know, rising star. But, you know, don't spend your money right away. See what the in-house publicist can do.
Too late. By then it's too late.
See how to help the inside publicist, not necessarily.
You want to tell us first?
Also, I agree with this entirely, actually. I use the in-house publicist for all of my books. I have friends who have gone to independent publicists, paid an enormous amount of money with whether realistic or unrealistic expectations of what that money would deliver, and were disappointed or worse in terms of what they got in terms of coverage. Maybe it had to do with publicists, maybe it had to do with unrealistic expectations of what the book could do. I also think it's really important to think in terms of a career, from a writer's point of view. And your first book may not be the book that breaks the bank. Your third book may not be the book that breaks the bank. If you're in for the long haul, I mean, marketing and selling these books and getting them promoted and getting them reviewed or getting interviewed is really important. And it does sell books. But if you're in it for the long haul, then presumably the first book leads to the second book, leads to the third book, and so on and so forth. So it's important to think about each book as an entity, but it's also important to think about how all of these projects add up to a career and what the shape of the career is. So I would caution against putting too much weight on the first book. That said, that doesn't mean you should back off on the first book, but think about where you want to be in 10 years as opposed to where you want to be in 6 months.
Okay, your best shot is with your first book, right?
I'm not so sure.
And if your first couple of books bomb, you're going to have a hell of a time finding a publisher who's going to publish your third and fourth book.
Well, your first two books, you'll get, depending on the publisher, right, you sell your first book and then you get a first look option on your second book. So most likely, if you sell the first book, you'll get a second book.
They'll dump that.
And then you can, if the second book doesn't sell, you can jump to a new publisher and probably get a third book out. So you've got a 3-book
there's
window.
Bookscan now. The other publishers know how much the first
Well, I mean, this is, I think, again, I'm in many ways an idealist, and I think good work wins out. And I think that it's important to sell books, but it's also important to write well and do the work. And I think that the sort of frenzy over selling and marketing sometimes gets in the way of the aesthetics of writing. And so I just think it's important to keep a balance.
That gentleman. Yes.
I was wondering whether there's ever any times where there's social or political pressure not to review an author's book or interview an author. I'm thinking specifically of someone like David Ray Griffin, who's written like 6 or 7 books about the possibility that what we were told about 9/11 is not the truth. And if he's right, which it looks like he is, then it's the biggest story of the 21st century, and yet he's been having a hard time. And so his last book's finally been addressed to Congress and to the media. So I'm wondering whether what are sort of the architecture behind the scenes of things that are maybe too incendiary?
I think you have to believe it first. I mean, or to at least find it credulous. It's like, okay, well, this doesn't sound like ranting. It sounds like, it's not my point of view, but he's constructed this in a logical way. It's tremendously provocative. Let's see what people think about it. But if it comes off as sort of like helicopter stuff, then I think that's harder to get on, because I just think it's harder to get on.
I would say I haven't, there's only one place I worked where there was corporate pressure not to cover certain kinds of books. Other than that, everything has, you know, we have, if we're producers on a show and we book too many sort of just, you know, whatever in your head you would call crazy or just fringe stuff, our ratings will go down, or, you know, we'll get the wrong kind of publicity. You know, we'll get all sorts of critical publicity about why are they having this person on or whatever. And if we can't keep our ratings up, we don't stay on the air. So that's the other, you know, our main fact of life.
Doesn't it also relate to what the host will tolerate too? I mean, that there's some things that your host, whoever he or she is like, I'm not talking about that. You know, for whatever reason, it's like it's just it's the box you have to work with.
Right, right. Every show has its own little format, and you know the host, and you know what they gravitate to or not, what they're uncomfortable with or not, and you know, and it's not like it's some sort of insidious thing. It's because you want your host to look good too. But if you don't have a host who's a very good critical thinker or something like that, then you don't want to do something that they would really, like Douglas Fife has a book coming out. Mm-hmm. So if you do not have, if the host of the show that you're working on is not really a political animal or a deep thinker or something like that, you're not going to try and get Douglas Fife on because you need to ask that guy questions. And you know, you need somebody who's going to be able to take it apart. And so, you know, there's all sorts of things that play into why you fight for something and why you don't.
Madeline.
I've heard rumors about the bestseller list, and I was curious to have it kind of vetted here, that that the LA Times only goes to 3 or 4 different bookstores and uses those sales numbers. Can you answer that for us as to how that comes about?
I don't put the bestseller list together, so I can't give you immense specifics, but we definitely go to more than 3 or 4 bookstores.
5. Yes.
To what extent do authors' websites and Googling the author factor into your work and selection of guests?
Some, not a whole lot.
Oh, do you guys Google the author? Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Nexus the author.
Yeah.
I can get a whole bunch of interviews if the author has, say the author's in Wisconsin. He needs to talk to his hometown here, he's gone to Chicago, and he's gone somewhere else, and they've all written up things about it. I'll go find those and read those interviews and see kind of what's in there that is interesting.
Yeah, I do I mean, we have a researcher on our show who prepares a research packet, and we'll get transcripts from past interviews, or you know, we'll give him specific parameters. But I also, you know, I see if they have a website. I want to see what they say about themselves. I want to see how they present themselves. I want to see what their fans say. So for me, it's just another research tool. You know, something, but whatever we would get from out of a LexisNexis or survey or research search is much more valuable because it's sourced. And so that's, you know, everything has to have, even anything that we give our host, this has been the same on every show I've worked in, anything that we give our host, any background material, has to be sourced. You can't just say, I found this article and it says this.
So the website matters, but not as much as what else is out there.
Right. The other interviews they've done.
Especially if the website jives with an article that was written about them in the New York Times, so it's consistent information. You're always, you know, we're always worried about getting host. Everybody is. So you want to make sure if he says A here, he says A there, so it's everything's all in sync. And nobody's trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes.
Speaking of hooks, if you write an autobiography or memoir, tell the truth.
Yes. This lady here.
Hi, I just wondering, listening to everything you all are saying very intently, and I know that you said that you don't necessarily separate out genres, you look for a good book and all of this stuff, but with regards to properly publicizing your book and finding the right niche, listening to some of the fiction books you mentioned, a lot of them seem to be literary fiction, and I know that when you find a publisher, the in-house publicist will be able to probably put you in at least a semi-right direction. But my question is, if you are an author who is specifically written in a genre, in a specific genre, are there any suggestions you would give directly to, the author, just for their knowledge, to make sure you are finding that right niche and you are not pitching to somebody who just doesn't do your type of book?
I would say do research. Research the publications. Depending on what your genre is, there are publications that deal specifically with various genres. The mystery magazines, science fiction magazines, romance, etc. And then in terms of general interest publications, and you guys can talk to the non-print side, in terms of general interest publications, check out the publications and see whether they cover or how they cover your genre. One of the issues with print book review publications is they often create genre columns and only review genre books within genre columns. We have some genre columns online, but we also review individual genre titles, as single reviews in print and also online. But research the publication, see how they cover it, see who covers it. In some cases, there may be, if it's a column, it will be one person who's writing about all the books in that particular genre. Is it possible to send the book directly to that person, or do you have to send, sometimes those are freelancers, sometimes those are staff writers. But my sense is if there's a way to cut out the middleman as much as possible and get your book in the hands of the person who is either going to be writing about your genre or making decisions about your genre, then that's the best way to go. The more layers you have to go through, the less likely it is that, just the less likely it is you're going to get the book to the right person. You want to get the book to the person who can actually make a decision and act on it.
Okay. Yes?
Hello. Thank you all for being here. I'm Vicki Wagner. My question is specific, kind of tag on what she was just saying. Now, you guys are all talking about niche, niche, niche. I'm a gay person, and I got kicked out of the Air Force for being gay. I had a top secret clearance. Are you suggesting that I only stick to targeting gay publications and all this? Because I don't really think that that's just a gay issue. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I'm not suggesting I'm suggesting you target gay publications and mainstream publications. I think if you're speaking to a particular constituency or speaking out of a particular constituency, in some ways, I don't know if I'd say you have an advantage, but in some ways you have an advantage because you can hit targeted niche publications and you can also hit mainstream publications. And so I would go the full 9 yards and hit everybody. I think
You've got it easy.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. You've got it easy. But I think you can go. I think you should go as wide as possible. I think that most mainstream publications at this point define mainstream very broadly, or the good ones do, the ones that are worth reading and the ones that are worth being covered.
But again, the small article in the Advocate could lead to the larger article in the Los Angeles Times, which could lead to an NPR booking, which could lead to something on the Today Show. It's a chain. So you've got an easy. You're in great shape. I mean, if you don't want to do the gay angle, you can do the military angle. There are plenty of military-related publications. Start with one of those. It'll be much easier to get into that type of publication again, which will catch the eye of a producer on radio or television.
Yeah, my guess would be, once you say top secret clearance kicked out, the antennas sort of go up.
It's a great elevator. That's a great elevator pitch too. Right there, you caught our interest.
Yeah, but does it matter when all of a sudden you have 10 books that come out in 1 year about the military?
You can't say
So
that,
that works against
but the personal story always is something that people, at NPR anyway, can relate to. You know, people aren't, they're not reading it and they're not watching it. They're usually driving in the car or they've got, you know, earbuds on or something. And to hear, you know, coming up, we're going to talk to Vicki Wagner, who used to be in the Air Force and, you know, had the highest clearance until, you know, they discovered she was gay. They asked, she told, she's gone. We're going to talk to her in a minute. I would want to listen to that because it's sort of bringing a lot of policy down to a personal level that's digestible as opposed to military boilerplate on, you know, whether or not gays can remain in active service.
And it's so, until you're on the inside of a TV show and you're in the booking meetings, there's so many things that are just fine lines. And, you know, when I hear that, I think that's a great, I agree with everybody. I mean, that's something that would have many places for you to pitch that story, many people that would be interested in it. And I can see myself bringing it up in a booking meeting, and I can see what this executive producer is saying, which is that needs more time than we can give it. I mean, there are some stories that, in our estimation, you need like a news magazine so they can talk to the person who said this, and they can talk to you, and they can talk to the person who first said that you needed to get out of the military. They can talk to the other person who worked with you who said it didn't darn thing. Who knew, we were keeping the world safe, and
so put
it all together and make a real solid, fully dimensional story. Exactly.
It would be a piece about you as opposed to a straight interview with you, but that also sells books.
And radio, I think, can do that too, where they'll put a whole piece together, and talk to several, to have a nice edited piece.
I just want to bring back, because I think this is a perfect example. If you do a Dateline or a 60-minute thing, if you give the whole story away, though, no one will want to read your book. I saw that woman, I heard her story for 15 minutes, I got it from beginning to end. There's no reason for you to buy her book. So you've got to hold something back, or tease something, or in some way not give it all away. If you give it away, nobody's going to want to read it.
Okay, how much more time do we have, Evan? 1 minute. Okay, one last question. I don't know, you guys pick somebody. I can't pick. Okay, I'm going to pick Tracy because she's my student. She puts up with me once a week, so.
I just want to thank you guys all for being here. I am working on a memoir, and I understand that genre is questionable now, but since the personality of the writers and their personal histories are so important, do you think that the writer of a memoir would be somebody you would want to interview over a fiction author? Let's say you're put in a jam, and you have to choose between the fiction writer and the author of a memoir.
Depends on the book. Did you sleep with your father like Kathleen Harrison?
And we probably wouldn't.
I'm not saying I wouldn't give resistance, but I sort of like those stories that make people go, how are you going to do that? Because it's a challenge to do it on a national radio show where, kids were in the car because you picked them up from school, and with something like that we would say, and the host would say, well, and a warning to our listeners. It's a very dicey subject matter, and we probably wouldn't talk about it as directly as we would in here, but the whole idea of this particular kind of character abuse, which is basically what it was, even though it was consensual, or she thinks it was consensual, is an interesting thing.
Yeah. It's flavored every book that she's written. It's like, what I remember about her is, this is the woman who slept with her father.
Who said she slept?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, somebody needs to check that out, right?
You're right. But I just feel like...
She wrote a novel about it first.
Well, she did. And Fran Lebowitz, the New York writer, which I'm paraphrasing, is just because something interesting has happened in your life doesn't mean that other people want to read about it. And, it's like sometimes it's just like, you really don't have to tell everything.
The question is not whether you slept with your parent, but insight about it. That's what makes the good scene with your parents.
When your father was scarred forever.
Yeah, right. Okay, I'm really sorry to have to stop. It's not my fault, it's their fault. But thank you guys.